Hey, hey, hey. It's Filter Free Friday, y'all. Listen, I am so glad that y'all here. I It has been a really long week, but one of the most exciting things that has happened reminded me of one of my first internships when I was in college. I remember when I first showed up that it was one of my first experiences with people using the term reverse racism. You see, I was an Inroads intern. And if you're not familiar with Inroads, Inroads is a program that supports creating experiences for students who have been historically left out of corporations by and large to give them access and opportunity to demonstrate what they've learned and to get corporate experiences. Most of the Enrolled students in 1994, when I had my first internship, were Black and Brown. And what's fascinating is that when people were talking about reverse racism with the Inroads program, and let me know where you're watching from, please, because I would be interested in that. People didn't want to acknowledge that prior to the 1980s that Black and brown people were not allowed to work in corporations, that legitimately the only people that were hired in corporations were white people. And if you go back before 1960s, they would be white people who were also male. And so when you think about 1994, most of the Black people I knew, and honestly, most of Black people in general were not having experiences where they grew up with parents who were working inside corporations, understood the politics of corporations, understood ideas of networking, just as a regular part of growing up and working. And so when someone said to me that the Inroads program was reverse racism because there was no specific program for white students, what they didn't acknowledge was that every internship prior to Inroads was designed and the funnel was for white students. So why do I bring that up on a Filter Free Friday? I know all of you are aware that I am trying to launch an empathy revolution, and trying to launch this empathy revolution has confused some people. They're like, "What are you doing?" Um, but I want to be super clear that I am not talking about emotional empathy or affective empathy. I'm not talking about being able to feel what another person feels, good or bad, because actually that's kind of hard to teach. What is easier to teach is cognitive empathy or mental empathy, the ability to look at you and recognize that what you think, feel, and believe makes total sense to you, even if inaccurate. And when you contrast like being in engineering school where facts could only be proven or disproven, with when I would be in my logic and reason class or in some of the social science courses where people would have opinions about factual information. In fact, being asked what were their opinions about factual information, it was jarring to me, quite frankly, because opinions can be agreed with or disagreed with. Universal evidence-based and proven facts cannot be agreed with or disagreed with. They can only be proven or disproven. And I believe, this is my opinion, that it is almost impossible to create inclusive spaces. It is impossible to engage in change in a way that brings all people along. It is impossible to address some of the nation's most persistent challenges if on the foundation is ignorance. And people can just say, I don't like that thing you doing. Case in point, one of the people I coach told me this week about a person in their organization who, when for the first time in I don't know, probably their entire career, they had to work with a Black man. And to this Black man, they keep calling him colored. And in addition to calling him colored, in the book, the Spark the Heart, I mentioned how sometimes people really don't know the difference between colored and people of color. I know it's astonishing, but some people do not. But this person went so far as to say that colored people Organizations need colored people on their teams to pick cotton. He also made a couple of references to the KKK. And what is astonishing to me, not that someone would engage in poor behavior, but that when someone engages in poor behavior, the system then supports or upholds that poor behavior by saying, let's just write this person up. You see, I wrote an entire book called The Power of 7 Second Chances Obtaining Success Without Firing the Rest. I am not a person who says that you should just fire people. I am relentlessly focused on the fact that people make mistakes, and in places where people make mistakes and they can grow from those mistakes, that we have safer cultures where people are more innovative and creative. In fact, that has been proven. However, when someone is hateful, to me, that is like planting dandelions in the middle of your tomato garden and then being like, well, we got, let's give these dandelions a chance. You see, there are medicinal purpose for dandelion greens. They are actually not weeds. We can eat dandelions. However, if I'm trying to grow tomatoes, I'm not making space for those weeds in my garden. See, and when we think that inclusion means everything, we think inclusion means to include every perspective, then we go south. See, and you cannot be empathetic. You cannot um grow organizational outputs because um if empathy is sitting on ignorance, how can you possibly? Ronnie, I appreciate your question. Is it an opinion that a fact can't be disproven because it's a fact? I'm just going to clarify. Facts can either be proven or disproven. So as scientists, when we get new information, we change. You see, because when you get new information, you should change. So at one point, we thought, hey, you should drink all the milk you can because it makes you stronger, because that's what people were telling us. But now, what we've come to learn is that actually dairy causes inflammation, and that certain people probably shouldn't be eating dairy at all because they are lactose intolerant. And that in an effort to try to keep dairy farmers in business, we pushed the dairy narrative. And so the opinions don't change the facts that there was a financial reason for people positioning certain things as factual when they weren't. So that takes me to this idea around reparations. I used to be ignorant on reparations, and so I don't hold it against people who are ignorant on reparations. But in my lovely town, I learned that Brush Creek, and thank you to Councilwoman Melissa Robinson for bringing this up this week because I didn't realize it. I have always known that the Brush Creek that runs east and west across our city has been, it looks completely different on the white side of town than it does on the black side of town. And I thought it was because of that the repair wasn't happening on the black side of town. But here's what I learned. It was actually built in the budget and built that on the white side of the town, that the Brush Creek Basin has a concrete floor. And on the black side of town, it has a mud floor. Racist much? Now, when I'm saying that we need to be more empathetic, when I'm talking mental empathy, actually, if I understand the pathology of the people who sit in the room and go, you know what, in the Country Club Plaza, let's put a concrete basin underneath this thing, but then in the third district, let's put a mud basin under it, then you understand very clearly why that doesn't make perfect sense to me. It makes perfect sense to those people. And and so when I put together programs and I say ashamed adults are not learning adults, let me be very, very clear. Sometimes guilt and shining a spotlight on some of the behaviors that people have is a really good motivator for people to change, especially when they have nefarious intentions. But if I sit back and go, oh, I would never make that kind of choice, and then I assume you also won't make that kind of choice, that's not being empathetic, actually. That is assuming you are me. That is not taking any into consideration what you really think and believe. And when we understand the true savagery of capitalism in this country, I think we'll start to behave differently. In fact, Laura, I did get your call and I need to call you back because I'm all in. Count me all in. And so when we are thinking about um an HR department that would say, "Oh yeah, just write somebody up who said, call me a Ku Klux Klan. We need some colored people around here to pick the cotton." I'm I used to be confused, but I'm not anymore. I'm just disappointed. And I got some props today. I got a glass, got some water in it. Let's imagine that this glass got water in it, but by law, I'm gonna take this glass and I'm gonna sit it on its side and I ain't gonna put no water in it. Okay? So what people want to do here in these here United States and pretty much all in every region is to say, by law, we done turned Black folk, African American descendants of slaves, basically on their side. You know how? We forced labor without pay for centuries. And then when we were asked to, when we said we were going to repair the harm by giving folks their 40 acres and a mule, like we're going to write this jar, we're like, yeah, nah. And then we tell folk, yeah, you can join the military. In the state of Mississippi, do you know that there were 3,000 veterans that came back from the war who were offered the GI Bill, and two of them were Black who actually got those GI Bill benefits? It is a turning on the glass. I mean, you think Black people weren't paying taxes during that time? Of course they were. So by law, we're gonna build the Brush Creek Basin on one side with concrete, and on the other side, we're gonna put a mud floor. And then you see trash build up, you see trees growing through it. In the Country Club Plaza, you can get in a dang boat and like tour the creek. I can't even walk the sidewalk at the creek on the east side of town. Now, to Councilwoman Robinson's point, they've been given $20 million to repair it. But when I was sitting there this week listening to, you've got three Black people on the stage sharing facts about the history of racial pillage and harm in this country related to Black folk by law. And then you got two white folks sharing their opinions. Some of those opinions were things like, well, what's going to be the race relations if you do reparations in Kansas City? Well, I love Mickey Dean's answer to that question. When you ask people about what does it look like, what's the race relations going to be like, what you're basically saying is like, how do white people feel? Like my question would be, what's the race relational problem with the fact that white folk in our town can shoot people through doors and not be arrested? And now you see it happening in other places throughout the country. And when you look at what the newspapers are saying, it's like, oh, woman killed by a feud. No, that's not what happened. Known racist shoots neighbor through door in front of her 9-year-old child. That's what you say. And so when people act like empathy is not the answer here, I keep saying that cognitive empathy and mentally understanding that, look, evidence-based and proven that what you have done and are continuing to do to Black people in this country is the equivalent of laying a glass on its side and saying, hey, just pour equal amounts of water in both glasses. I love the pull yourself up by the bootstrap narrative. You know why I like it? Because it is impossible to be sitting down and to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. So when you say, I've got myself up by the bootstraps, what you're saying is you must have overcome the impossible. And what made it so that you could overcome the impossible was that somebody was pouring water in your glass that was right side up. Meanwhile, the federal government and every municipality in every state and every city was turning by law everything related to Black people on its side. For those people who did get their 40 acres and a mule, you know what happened when Andrew Johnson became president? They took it back. And I think it's astonishing. I think it is astonishing that here we are coming up on Juneteenth. 2 years later, folk find out that the slavery had been abolished. You think that if people had property, that in a nation where we say the Confederacy is, you know, we got Robert E. Lee streets and counties named after Andrew Jackson, like you think people wasn't taking folk properties? You think they weren't? And what you think the government was doing? Absolutely nothing. And then people are like, "Ah, I don't know how we gonna pay for it." Everything the government has ever wanted to pay for, it has. Nothing like the COVID-19 pandemic to show you that when we need to come up with some money for something, we will. And so it's interesting that when we talk about repair and harm that's been done to Black people, that we just can't figure out how to turn this glass right side up. And quite frankly, I think most Black people would tell you, look, just stop pushing my glass so I can get it turned right side up on my own. Just stop turning it on its side. And these equality people and it ain't fair people are the ones whose family they have not done their own racial reckoning in their own families. Do you live in the suburbs? How was that possible? Were Black people able to live in the suburbs while your family was living in the suburbs, or was it illegal? Are you sure your family did not reap the benefits of the GI Bill when Black people could not? Are you certain that your family was not the recipient of land grants in the West while Black people were not being given any? Some people given 400 acres at the same time, Black folk not giving their 40 acres and a mule. And that might say is old history. And so we shouldn't have to talk about that today. Well, let's look at what's happening today. Look at how schools are funded today. Let's look at maternal death rates today. Let's look at food apartheid in Black communities today. Don't call it food desert. We used to have grocery stores. You can put Dollar Trees and Family Dollars in Black neighborhoods. Why can't grocery stores be there? You see? Because we still, by law, turning the glass on its side. Somebody said, well, what about crime? Crime? Really? There were 100 documented, listen, evidence-based and proven, documented massacres in this country for after the end of slavery. Documented. We got an entire museum about the lynchings of Black people in this country. Who you think was doing all that massacre in? It's gaslighting to talk about Black on Black crime. It is a lack of empathy for yourself. You see, if you look at your own history and you go inside and say, what has happened to me by watching this pillage and terror and violence and me just turning away from it? What is the pathology that happens for it when you just think about what happened with Ralph Yarl and the fact that he was shot through a door and he just going to go get his siblings? What do you think the children of the people who went over there to clean up the evidence? What kind of trauma you think gets passed down in their generation? You see, because all we want to talk about is the trauma that Black people hold in their bodies, but true empathy is going, you know what? Let me understand what happened to those folks over there. Can you imagine this lady done shot somebody in the chest through the door in front of her child? And we're gonna talk about, well, what about those Black children? Let me, I don't think this center in whiteness. I say, let's look at the children of that white known racist who shot through the door. What were her children doing? What gets passed down to them as they observe this? You see, I'm so excited my interns are here this week because we are working on a project related to learned helplessness. And whenever I tell the learned helplessness stories about fleas being stuck in glasses, everybody want to talk about the behavior of the fleas, like there's something uniquely wrong with fleas. But let me ask you this: who put the fleas in the glass with the lid on it? We don't ever want to look at the scientists' hands are always gloved. We can't see it. See? And so it's easier to talk about this week with the reparations thing. This guy brings up, well, Barack Obama said that the Black men need to be in the house. What? And here's what's sad. Black people adopt these same narratives. But when you practice empathy, see, when you understand mentally, not emotionally, I don't need you to understand my emotions. I need you to understand mentally the pathology of a group of people who will know that President Nixon on purpose created an entire, look, evidence-based and proven out of his own mouth, this ain't my opinion, that he had to find a way to disrupt, distract, divide Black communities. And so he said, what we're going to do is create a fake scenario about drugs in Black communities. And we're going to round up these Black men and we're going to put them in jail. And today, the United States of America is number one in incarcerating its citizens, and disproportionately, those people are Black men. And so, what kind of non empathetic stance is it to not understand the pathology of a person who would do that and then say to you, well, yo, Black men ain't at home? Now, let's talk about this. Evidence-based and proven that Black men are more involved in the lives of their children. Our family structures look different than other people's. When you consider who helps with their children the most, it is Black men. And yet these false narratives continue to persist to say, even with my friends who know that they Black daddy was in their house, who had multiple Black fathers to support them, we'll say, well, what we got to do is, where the Black daddies? They at home taking care of their children. See, and this narrative gets perpetuated on the media. It gets perpetuated in schools. It gets perpetuated on bus stops, in classrooms, everywhere. Because you want to try to just keep this glass on the side. See, but I'm going to tell you, there ain't nothing wrong with Black people except for we think there's something wrong with Black people. And when you understand that, then you know you can take a very empathetic stance and say, I understand that what another person thinks, feels, and believes makes total sense to them, regardless of if it's rooted in fact or not. My favorite engineering professor was Gary Tatterson. And I cannot imagine, because I'm biased about this thing, see, I cannot imagine going to Gary Tatterson and saying, you know, that fluid dynamics principle you just shared, I disagree. And I disagree because my listeners on my radio show don't think that that's how fluid dynamics work. We need to think about the stuff that we say and we make space for. And while I was grateful for the panel discussion, let me tell you what the organizers of the reparations discussion did. They had two white men who were opposed to reparations. They had the sister from Evanston, Illinois, who was critically involved in getting reparations started in Evanston, talking about specifically the things that they've done and how it works. And then we had Councilwoman Melissa Robinson, who is on the Commission for Reparations in Kansas City, which I would argue we don't need more data. We got enough data. It's just a form of delaying again, because facts ain't never caused nobody to change. Sometimes you just got to make people change. And then you had Mickey Ding, who has talked reparations for the better part of 30, if not 40 years. And so here's what you end up having on the stage. It looks like Black versus white. You don't think that PBS could find some white folk that understand the history of race and pillage in America and the importance of the need for reparations? Of course they could. And then thoughtful questions, questions that really interrogate what the how would look like. None of those questions got asked. The questions that got asked were like, what do you think? What do your listeners think? How do people feel? And one of the panelists went so far as to say, if we don't handle white guilt first, then there's no way we can get to reparations. But here, I wanted to share with y'all why I think all of this is an exercise in futility, but we're going to keep working on it. The New York Times published this week, June 7th. The truth is, many Americans, and what they mean when they say many Americans, they mean white. The white part's silent. So even in this headline, they done left Black people out. The truth is, many Americans just don't want Black people to get ahead. Right there. Read the article. And it will tell you everything you need to know. Look at these people. Mamas. These are people's mamas. Just look. States' rights, angry. These are the people who turning over buses. And I will tell you, Toni Morrison said it best. She said, you go to the corners of the earth, please. And you can go into prisons if you want to. And you find me 20 Black women who will turn over a bus with children on it, of any race, because you can't find it. But look at this. Look at this. And think about that man this week who said, we need, what we need is some black folk to pick our cotton. This is my opinion. And it's my opinion based on my very empathetic stance that I got. If we want to repair the racial harm that we have done in this country, we can. We don't want to. It's Filter Free Friday, y'all. We got work to do.